Hi everyone. So today we're looking at the story of English. So we're just going to summarize a little bit an overview of it. So generally the divisions of time are split between Old English. So we're looking at the year 500 to 1050 CE. Middle English between 1050 and 1550 CE. Early Modern English 1550 to 1700 CE. So this is really important because it actually coincides with the Middle Ages. So you know how you guys are studying medieval Europe? This is the language changes that happened during that time. And the reason why we're interested in this is because we need to know how English has developed over time, how it was influenced by other languages and other cultures, but also so that you can understand the language that was used by your character in medieval times. So remember that the Middle Ages, the medieval time period began in 476 CE with the fall of the Roman Empire, and it ended around about 1453 when the Renaissance began. So we're sort of looking around Old to Middle English, and that's the sort of time period that we'll be focusing our monologues on. So just a little bit of a recap on Old English. So the Celts arrived in England about 500 BCE. So they were the Scottish, Irish, Welsh. They were the original Celtic speakers. So there's very little Celtic left in modern English, but you know it's important to know that it originated from there. So the Romans occupied Britain from 43 CE to about 470 CE. So there wasn't really sort of much to do with their language on that Celtic influence. So the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes, by about 700 CE, they were the ones that occupied most of England. And the Angles gave us the name of our language, which it used to be English, but it's now obviously English. So the Anglo-Saxons were just agricultural people. So most of their words used had to do with farming and daily experiences living off the land. So they were, common sorts of words like plow and dirt and farm and food and those sorts of things. So some of the most common words in our language actually still come from Anglo-Saxon words. So was, father, house, God, him, he. Even though the spelling was different, we still use those words from Anglo-Saxon times. So some Latin and Greek, which a lot of our words are actually based upon, came in around about 597 CE from Christian monks that had brought that language with them. So when Christianity grew in England, those words actually came with it. So new words were being introduced. Then you had the Vikings landing. So you've probably heard about this in HSS, but the Vikings landed in about 793 CE. And that's when they brought their language called Old Norse. Okay, so that sort of blended with the Anglo-Saxon words, and some of the words were quite similar anyway. So both of the words were used. They had the Norse words and the Anglo-Saxon words. So when the Viking invasion happened, they added over 2,000 words to the English language, and half of the common words that we use today actually come from Old English and Norse origins. Yeah, so I think it's pretty cool that we still use some Old Norse, which is basically Viking language. So when you're using words like give, take, get, both, that is all Norse. Words like cake, egg, sister, rag, freckle, ugly, lake, those are all Norse words. And a lot of the cool Norse words like skin and scab and berserk, muck, knife, die, murder was also a Norse word. A lot of the violent kinds of words with the k sort of sound, those are actually Norse words because we know that the Norse Vikings were had a bit of a reputation for being a bit violent. So some of those words were introduced because if there was no word for it, then often people would adopt a word from another culture. Okay, so if you walked, into the forest and you found something that you've never actually used before, and then somebody else has a different word for it, then you would generally adopt that word. So that's how a lot of words were also introduced. So we went from using runic alphabet, and runic alphabet is like symbols and like looking sort of images, I suppose. And we changed to using the alphabet that we use today around the 7th century. Okay, so that's when our current letter formation or something similar came into effect. So then we go into the time period of Middle English, which is about 1050 to 1550. And Middle English is an important time because that's when the Normans brought French with them. So you had the thing called the Norman Conquest. I'm sure you've heard about it in HSS, but in 1066 it was William the Conqueror who invaded England. So he actually brought French to England, and it became the ruling language. So all of the nobles, including William the Conqueror, actually only spoke French. So the reason why we have French words in our language today is because William the Conqueror spoke French and he didn't speak English. So when he invaded England, he made everybody start speaking French. And by everybody, I mean the ruling class, the government, any of the sort of wealthy or nobles. So the poorer people continued to speak Old English, okay, which was mainly used sort of Celtic Norse words because they were lower class, okay, and they were illiterate, so they couldn't actually read or write. So um, it's important to distinguish that. So then, if you've got French being spoken by the upper class and the government, and then you've got Old English being spoken by the lower class, that creates a big divide between the two groups. The ruling class speaking a completely different language to the lower class. Okay, so that's really quite important to remember. So the French was seen as being more sophisticated, and it became the language of the government. So the poor were really left out of that sort of decision-making process, and the fact that they weren't able to read or write really sort of alienated them. And there were about 300 years where English actually wasn't written because French was the dominant language for writing, and like I said, poorer people were illiterate, so it meant they couldn't read and write. So it's important to know that English had been influenced by many languages, but French and Latin have had the most influence. They make up about 58% of the English vocabulary today, and about 29% of that is French. So there are around about 10,000 words that have been borrowed from French and turned into English, so either directly used or slightly changed. So words like souvenir, bouquet, cafe, brunette, blonde, picnic, salad, omelette, menu, those sorts of words. A lot of stuff to do with food, actually, French words. Serviette. Then you have the words to do with government, a lot of them like parliament, castle, court, royal, servant, crown. All of those are actually derived from French. So when we're learning spelling, you know how we will focus on Greek, Latin, and French roots and learning the spelling of those words based on those rules. It's because English is a mixture of all of those kinds. So that's why spelling can sometimes be pretty tricky. So when we started to really stop using French as the dominant language in government was when France and England decided to, they decided that they didn't really like each other very much. And they had a war called the 100 Years' War, which actually, funnily enough, went for 116 years. So during the 100 Years' War, French actually became the language of the enemy. Okay, and the reason was because King Henry IV in 1399 was the first English-speaking king to come into power again, and so English sort of got a bit of a revival because English was his native language, and the French sort of became the enemy there. So what we'll do, we'll probably leave it there for today, and I'm going to create a quiz for you guys to be able to complete as well, and I'll do that today, and I'll pop that on Andy. So hopefully you learn a little bit of a background understanding today of the different story of English and where it came from. So Old English and Middle English is sort of where we've focused on, and we've left off with the 100 Years' War. So we'll continue with more in our next video. Okay, thanks guys, have a great day.